and welcome everyone. It's wonderful to see such a large audience joining us today as we welcome a fantastic lineup of speakers to discuss the future of Holocaust memory. And I thank you very much for taking the time to participate in this session. I am Dr Victoria Walden, a senior lecturer at the University of Sussex in the School of Media, Arts and Humanities, and a member of the Sussex Weidenfelder Institute of Jewish Studies here, and I'll be chairing today's session. The theme for Holocaust Memorial Day 2021 is Be the Light in the Darkness. This phrase is forward-thinking. The light symbolizes a hope, moving through the darkness and having the power to disrupt and change it for the better in the future. This year, we also find ourselves confronting a particular light source, perhaps more regularly than we used to, and perhaps more often than we want to. And this is our computer screen as we connect with others through images beamed at us from afar, as we are doing for this session. The restrictions of the pandemic have, of course, brought many challenges to all of us. Holocaust museums and memory sites have had to close their doors and negotiate their site and object-based exhibitions and programs with remote access for visitors and learners. Yet the restrictions have also created surprising opportunities, not least enabling our speakers to join us today from 4 different countries with relative ease, but also a moment to reflect on the opportunities digital media might enable for the future of Holocaust memory. Of course, it must be acknowledged that many Holocaust museums, memory sites, and educational organizations have been working on digital projects for years, from interactive survivor biographies and 3D apps of concentration camps, to VR tours of Majdanek and Anne Frank's house, and United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Kristallnacht exhibition, Once in Second Life, and of course, many, many active social media accounts. Also, whilst our connection with people and places outside of our homes might currently feel entirely digital, physical historical sites, material evidence, and in-person commemorative practices remain, and I believe will remain crucial to Holocaust memory. Indeed, technology is not the only issue people studying and working in Holocaust commemoration and education are currently contemplating. Holocaust denial and distortion and anti-Semitism are becoming increasingly more visible and dangerously more mainstream, as are far-right ideologies more broadly. And whilst much of the discussion about this on social media platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Acon, and Parler, we're also seeing this hateful discourse emerging from those in positions of political power in several countries too. So I've asked each of our guest speakers today to present a short response to the question, what is the future of Holocaust memory? They will each speak for 10 to 15 minutes, and then I will share questions after this. You can give us your questions by using the Q&A function on the bottom menu bar on your Zoom screen, and you can add questions here at any point during the presentations. We will come back to these at the end when all of our speakers have spoken. You can address your question to a particular speaker or the whole panel. We may not have the opportunity to cover every single question, but we will do our best to have a broad spectrum of questions that address to each of our speakers. So let me introduce our guests today. First off, we have Dr. Tobias Ibrak-Hartmann, who is a lecturer in visual culture, film, and German studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His research and teaching deals with media memory of the Holocaust, the use and appropriation of archive footage and digital memory culture, and he has published extensively in journals such as Memory Studies, New German Critique, the Leo Baeck Institute Yearbook, the Historical Journal of Film, Radio, and Television, and in the online journals Apparatus and Imaginations. He is Consortium Partner in the Horizon 2020 Innovation and Research Action, a Visual History of the Holocaust, Rethinking Curation in the Digital Age, and head of a research group on commemorating the Holocaust in the digital age, immersion, augmentation, and virtual reality at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. We then have Michael Haley Goldman, who is Director of the Future Projects at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Future Projects is a small innovation team designed to research, prototype, and explore emerging technologies that transform Holocaust memorialization and education. Mr. Haley Goldman has served as the museum's director of the Benjamin and Vladka Mead Registry of Holocaust Survivors and as the director of Global Classroom and Evaluation. He has a master's in education from Columbia University Teachers College. Our next speaker after that will be John Glancy, who is the executive producer for schools and families at Imperial War Museums. Here he manages a national program that covers the Imperial War Museum's 5 branches and online. John and his team are currently developing a new Holocaust learning program in collaboration with a leading digital studio and Olivier Award-winning Dramaturg, which will be launched in late 2021. Previous to working in heritage, John worked extensively in theatre across the UK as an actor, director and producer, including periods as head of creative learning at the Royal Lyceum in Edinburgh and schools producer at the Lyric in Hammersmith. John's creative practice is deeply rooted in community and youth engagement, inspired by his own experiences growing up in a deprived community in North Edinburgh. John believes that all culture is fundamentally storytelling, and this has empowered him to take a diverse cross-disciplinary approach to content creation in order to engage audiences across all walks of life. Then our final speaker is Dr. Eris Gorshek, who studied art and history in Hamburg and Prague. She worked many years as an archivist. In 2009, she became head of the educational department of the Neuengamme concentration camp memorial, and since 2016, she has been responsible for public relations and online communication here, and since 2020, for the foundation of Hamburg Memorials and Learning Centers commemorating the victims of Nazi crimes. So I will now pass over to Tobias.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for this kind introduction. I hope everyone can see the shared screen. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation to this very interesting and also think important event. I'm happy that I can start because I will not speak so much about the future of Holocaust memory. I will leave this to my colleagues from the memorial sites and museums, which are concerned with these questions, where to go to, and I love to contribute to this discussion afterwards. And in my presentation, I will mainly analyze what is happening right now, and maybe hint towards how the current situation will then also influence our future ways of commemoration. The presentation, which I want to give you in the next 10 to 15 minutes, is about a study which I'm currently conducting. I'm already conducting since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic about Holocaust memory and commemoration in times of COVID-19. And I will mainly focus on social media as a medium and responsive space for Holocaust commemoration and memory. And here it is quite interesting that up until the pandemic, of course, memorial sites and museums were using social media platforms, especially platforms like Facebook and Twitter, but mainly for communicating their activities, their educational content, and also the very unique documents, especially visual documents, which they preserve in their collections. Social media was not so much used for interacting with the users, and also not for gaining interactive power and agency to social media users. This was one reason why my colleague Wolf Kannsteiner diagnosed in 2017 that Holocaust memory has simply not yet arrived in the digital age. Projects on social media that tried to reach out to social media users and tried to adapt Holocaust commemoration and education to social media logics were mainly not institutional projects, but private projects, like, for example, the Ever Stories Instagram project in 2019, a series of 50 short Instagram stories that were launched on Holocaust Memorial Day, during Holocaust Memorial Day 2019 in Israel, using several of the specific Instagram aesthetics, including multi-layered screens, emojis and other things, hashtags, geolocation tags, in order to establish an engaging way for dealing with Holocaust memory. But many projects, like, for example, the totally kind of user-centered TikTok Holocaust Challenge last summer, still met a lot of reservations and also caused controversies because especially of the kind of non-institutional and user-centrist way of these forms of commemoration. So what was happening now was that many memorials being forced by the pandemic to reach out to their potential visitors via social media platforms because the pandemic forced them to close their sites and also to cancel the originally planned events, especially in context of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the concentration camps last spring. Many concentration camp memorials, sites, and museums immediately started not only to foreground digital content which they had already developed, and of course Holocaust memory is very much digital, and started very, very early with using and developing digital tools, digital applications. And I think we will hear more about all the augmented reality and even virtual reality projects that started in the last decade. But many are now reached out to social media platforms and tried to use them not only to communicate their activities, but also to develop new content in order to offer access to the sites from a distance. So the question of my study, of the study which I'm conducting together with my research team at the Hebrew University, is in which way the pandemic had a transformative effect on global Holocaust memory, especially concerning the use of online platforms and digital formats. And we can see, of course, that digital communication technology and social media served as a prothesis for commemorating from a distance in this particular situation. So what we did, or what we are still doing, is that we conducted an online survey at which 32 Holocaust memorials participated. We evaluated a sample of 63 digital Holocaust memory projects that were accessible online in the month between March and July 2020, and we conducted a multimodal visual analysis of selected projects. So I would like to share with you some of the content, some of the results which we found in this study. So first, the survey, which was mainly trying to answer the question how memorials and museums responded to the pandemic. And we had, as I already said, 32 museums participating, mainly from Europe and from North America and Israel. So what we clearly could see is that those areas of museum and memorial activities that were mainly affected by the pandemic from the perspective of the memorials and museums were the guided tours on the memorial or museum sites or through the exhibitions themselves, and the sector of education. And we will see that most of the projects that were generated during the last year responded to those areas, exhibition, guided tours, and education. We could then also see that here that the digital technology, which was used more intensely during COVID-19 in relation to before COVID-19, was also in these areas, in the area of museums and exhibitions and the educational sector. Both of them were already quite important for digital activities before the pandemic started, but you can clearly see that there was a huge and very important increase. This should not lead to the idea that this was a kind of revolution. So as I said before, Holocaust memorials were already very active in the area of using digital technology for commemoration. And so many institutions like the Wiener Holocaust Library also stated that in many ways COVID-19 has made activities that were always on the horizon to materialize. So we can also see that this offered a certain chance, so to say, to realize things which were already planned. But as we see, it also offered a lot of potential for experiments and for experimenting with social media and also with formats without kind of having this without having to be professional from the beginning. However, it would be interesting to see how now, after nearly a year of pandemic restrictions, we see also professionalization in this area. What we found is that the use of social media platforms clearly increased during the pandemic. And what we also see is that of course, a platform like Facebook, which was used already intensely before, also was used even more during the pandemic. But social media platforms like Instagram, especially, but also YouTube, became much more important because they were kind of tailored to audiovisual content, and this became quite important for many memorials in order to offer access to the sites through short videos, through live tours. Of course, the live features in Instagram and also then in Facebook became crucial for many memorials and museums. And YouTube is still a very important platform also to preserve the content and make it available via the websites. And this is quite interesting. We see that before the pandemic, the websites were one of the most important tools for many of the museums, but actually actually it stayed more or less the same in comparison to the social media platforms. And on the right, of course, you see that, like in many other areas, for example, also the area of education, Zoom became a Kickstarter and became very important for Holocaust commemoration from a distance as well. So the Anne Frank Zentrum in Berlin emphasized clearly that they reached much more visitors in webinars than other formats of teacher training in the past, and that lots of visitors to the memorial events attended via Facebook. So with our data sample, we tried to answer which online platforms and digital formats Holocaust memorials and museums used during the pandemic. So what we see is that, of course, there is a more intense use of more intense production of online projects that were launched since COVID-19 started. And here we also see the formats that became important. You see virtual tours. So online, any kinds of online tours became a very important element of many of the activities of many memorials, as well as online videos. And as I said, audiovisual formats are a very significant aspect here. Also, online exhibitions and webinars still are an important factor. And the platforms, as I already said, and also confirmed here, why websites are still important. We see really especially importance with YouTube, with Instagram, Facebook, and Zoom. So what is not surprising is that with the beginning of the restrictions, the implementation of social distancing regulations and the first lockdowns during the so-called first phase, the digital projects rose, and the high peak was, of course, not coincidentally at the period of most of the commemorative activities during spring 2000, when many memorial sites commemorated the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the camps, and when also Israeli Holocaust Memorial Day took place. And we could also see that the projects more or less remain on this level. So with our multimodal visual analysis, we wanted to get a better idea how the memorials and museums enabled commemoration from a distance. And what we see again is that this is not a kind of revolution in the sense that that things are totally newly invented, but that actually existing analog modes of remembrance and also of Holocaust education that already kind of are, so to say, best practice and state of the art were transferred to the digital content, were translated to the digital world. On one level was a way of transferring existing modes. For example, conversations with survivors were moved to Zoom, which enabled a form of communicative space to listen to survivors' testimonies, or as I already said, so the classical format of the guided tour at the memorial or museum's site transformed into virtual tours. On the second level, we saw that previous commemorative forms transitioned into a social media context by adjusting them to the social media logics. A good example for that is the online reading of Shoah victims' names campaign, which Yad Vashem started during Holocaust Memorial Day last year, when they asked social media users to post videos reading the names of victims of the Shoah, and then they composed from this a virtual name reading video. We will hear more about the great activities of the Neuengamme concentration camp memorial, but in Neuengamme they developed a lot of very interesting ways of kind of adjusting forms of explorative Holocaust commemoration to social media. And then we had cases where the modes of commemoration were transformed completely into digital narratives. For example, the cross-platform activities by the Mauthausen Memorial in the educational department, where they used digital videos in combination with other digital content, or the hashtag 75Liberation, which we may also hear more about, which was actually developed before the pandemic started, but became very crucial for commemorating online during that time. So what were the results? Or the preliminary results are that we see an intensification of digital and online activities, that there's obviously a translation of analog modes into digital modes of remembrance, that there was a lot of experimenting with new formats, that the pandemic had a transformative effect on global Holocaust memory, but that nevertheless the physical sites remain important for Holocaust commemoration, as the colleagues from the Below Forest Death March Memorial said. With the Corona pandemic and from now on, it is more about communicating content digitally. Nevertheless, I want to emphasize the importance of the place. The pedagogical work here is something completely different than only digital. So my projection for the future is that we are moving towards a more hybrid culture of commemoration, where the physical sites will still remain important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tobias, for sharing this really important and really comprehensive study, itself carried out under incredibly challenging times. So well done to you and Tom on your research team as well. I now want to move on to Michael, our second speaker.
Hey, everybody. Let me go ahead and share screens. You're all used to doing this whole routine now, so that will never get less awkward. So, hi, everyone. I'm Michael Haley Goldman. I am from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. I think thank you to Vicky and the people at Sussex for inviting me to this, because this is a great kind of prompt, right? This is the kind of thing we should all be thinking about and don't find in our everyday life often. Right? What is the future of Holocaust memory is a hard question. And what I realized as I was thinking about this is that, to me, the more interesting question for the work we're doing in our team at the US HMM is the question of how do we get to the future? I think at these times, as we are all here in pandemic land and as we are all doing things very, very differently, it's very easy to imagine that all of these new things we've been challenged with will carry over into the future. And I'd like to suggest that that is not inevitable, that we say that the world will be entirely different, and I think it will be, but how it will be different is a lot depending on the kind of thought we all give moving forward to the lessons we're learning during this time period. Tobias's research is really great because it helps us give a little bit of a glimpse into what we're seeing in terms of the changes and the creativity that's coming out of many institutions. Many of you, I assume out there, I can't see you, but I assume many of you are coming from other institutions. And we're all trying things that are very, very different because of the current situation. And for us to take the lessons we learned from that and move forward is a very conscious act. So I think I'm going to really try to focus in the next 10 minutes or so on this question of how do we get to the future? How do we do that intentionally? And I'm going to do that by way of talking a little bit about the balance between memory, memorialization, and education and learning, a little bit about our institution's response to COVID, and a little bit about where we think we are going to go next by the way of how we get there. So without further ado, the Holocaust Museum, I'm not going to assume too much that you know us well. We are the United States federal institution for the memory and education around the Holocaust. We are a memorial museum in Washington, D.C., part of the federal government, but of course, generously supported by the public, which allows us to do all the work we are involved in, ranging, of course, from exhibitions and education to training with the public, teachers, the police, the military, ranging into making sure our scholarship about the Holocaust is growing and strong, and into the prevention of genocide today. So there's an incredible amount of things that our institution's doing. I'm not going to really spend time on that, but I wanted to contextualize what we're saying in this. The museum started in 1993, so we're young by Holocaust institution standards. And when the museum was being planned, started under the Carter administration in the 70s, the question for the Memorial Council that created us was, is memorialization enough? And they decided that it was not, that we needed to be a memorial and a museum. And I'm going to show you a quote next. This is something that comes from a book written by Ed Linenthal fairly soon after the creation of our museum, talking about its creation. And I think this sets up the context. Now, pardon me, as I flip that around. I'm going to read this out loud for accessibility purposes, but also gives you hopefully a moment to think about what this quote says, which is, from the beginning then, creating the museum was understood as partially fulfilling the debt of remembrance. Any failure of historical or aesthetic representation would resonate as not just a mistake, but as a desecration of memory of Holocaust victims. So this idea of desecration of memory, I think, is probably familiar to many of you if you're working in Holocaust memorialization and education. This idea that we have been given the weight of memory and we need to take that incredibly seriously, and that doing that wrong has real consequences for memory is a really important piece. I will suggest, now this is not necessarily what everyone believes, but I will suggest from my point of view that this has always been an important tension in our institution between the concept of memorialization, where we have that debt of memory, and education, which from my educational training requires mistakes, right? A large part of creating an educational environment is creating the opportunity to make mistakes and to learn from them. So a lot of the work that I do in my institution is thinking about how you balance that debt of memory with creating really meaningful learning environments that people can make mistakes in, both as an institution and as an individual. So my role is in future projects, and nothing says the future like strange headgear. And there's nothing funnier than wearing a VR headset. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of the spirit. Our role in the museum is pretty unusual from people I've talked to in other institutions. Our role is to think about what is new, what has changed in terms of new technologies, new ideas, new approaches or techniques that can better enable us as an institution to fulfill our mission again being memorialization and education. So we take it very seriously that we have to find ways to think about how the latest technology in a VR headset or different approaches to talking about education might now allow us to do memorialization and education better. We try to bring it into the institution in a very, very immediate way, in a way that can then be brought to audiences. And this is something when I talk about how we get to the future, I'm going to come back to this in a little bit, but just give you a little bit of a pre-warning with that, is the idea that to understand the potential of these technologies, you really have to see what impact it has on those audiences in an immediate and quick way. And we're really dedicated to that as a way to move forward. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But to also just give you a little bit of the context of the institution, we have been doing a lot of interesting work with technology and with education and the impact education has on thinking about today. This is a reference to a really great exhibition that's our colleague Steve Luckert was the curator for, and a huge number of my colleagues worked on, that looked at propaganda under Nazi rule. But of course, thinking about propaganda then, for our audiences, they immediately made the connection, and this was about 8 years ago, to thinking about media today, thinking about how we receive information today and how that can be biased and how that can shape and change their thoughts. So talking about the past has immediate resonance on the future, and we would like to help our audiences to think in a critical way about the information they're receiving and use that in terms of what they're doing. So it balances both the historical and taking the historical seriously, but does also start to look at the landscape around us, which is digitally and changed space 8 years ago as it is today. Similarly, with the attack on the US Capitol that happened recently, we also have the ability to help people, this is a page from our website, think about the imagery that they saw in the photographs and film footage, like this particular flag, which is very closely based off of a Nazi flag. What does that imagery mean? Where does it come from? How do you understand the influence of the past on the events that are happening today? And I should point out that even though future projects, our team is relatively new, we are building on a great history in our institution of thinking about technology, thinking about a lot of different approaches and being able to really try to use those in different ways. As Tobias mentioned, we've been doing an incredible amount online in social media and in a wide variety of different platforms for a long time. So then, like many of you about a year ago, everyone you knew was trapped inside of tiny little boxes. And our institution had to struggle with what that issue that all of us face is, what does our work mean? How do we do it in the current situation? Now, I think there's a couple of things to point out. The teams that I work with include people who do physical exhibitions and work around our physical spaces as well as digital groups. We might have been a little bit ahead of the rest of our institution because of our large amount of digital work, but I still think it became a really interesting challenge. The other thing to note is we are very fortunate. As I mentioned, we are a federal institution with public and private funding. Unlike many of our colleagues in other institutions around the United States, we were not going through shutting our doors, losing income in that way. So we could really focus on how do we change our work, and how does that, how are we able to continue to do the work of Holocaust memory and education while we are online? Unlike some of the really interesting projects that you saw in the last presentation, our focus actually, because we were doing so much already on websites and on social media, was with the section of our institution that was really used to doing programs in person, right? These are the huge number of programs that we do for scholars, for the police, for students, that were relying on the idea that people came, they saw our exhibitions, they were able to interact with people in a firsthand way. All of those groups had to figure out how to move those programs online relatively quickly. And it was a moment of great creativity and stress. And I'd like to just, kudos to the teams that were behind that. A lot of our teams really tried to support that work as people moved online. But to kind of think about this, how do you get to the future question, I think it's kind of useful to think about what we were losing, right? And I think for many people, and I'm hoping this resonates with some of you out there, the loss of that experience of this person inside a physical space in an exhibit, immersed in an environment that's carefully created for the learning of the history and the experiencing of the past. I think people mourned that loss. People really wanted to see that continue. And unfortunately, I think what we really have to battle internally and externally is the urge to wrap up this incredible experience that we were experiencing in person and somehow replicate that in a digital way. I think that's been one of the hardest obstacles for people to overcome. And it's because the digital world is not something that has the same abilities and affordances that the physical world does. There's not an easy translation between the two. You really have to look at the strengths of each. Now, this sounds obvious when I say it out loud, I realize, but I think it's something that's very, very hard for people to let go of when they have this in their mind, and then they're trying to do something very, very different. Letting go is really, really hard. Again, how do you get to the future? How do you get to the fact that we are going to be doing things in a digital way that are different? Some of that is about letting go. Silver linings. The idea that the pandemic is a horrible thing, and there's no amount of silver linings that will make that better. But I think we can talk about some things that the forced step to every museum being shut down and being required to actually try to do things that are off-site did force us to do things that were different. In fact, the running joke internally is that now all of these great teams that have been doing different programs separately are now doing their programs in a way that they talk about them and they creatively think about making them better together. And all it took was a global pandemic. Honestly, the fact that change is possible partially because we have no choice is often good for us. It forces us to think differently. It forces us to try new things, and it forces us to get new perspective on the work that we're already doing. Another thing, and Vicky mentioned this a little bit, is the possibility of diversifying your programs is something that's very real. And some of my colleagues at the museum have been working really hard to talk about how we've wanted to diversify our programs, but suddenly, despite people having different workloads and different distances and different family constraints, we are able to bring in people into our programs in a way that's very, very different. And how do we capitalize on that? And most importantly, how do we continue doing that into the future? And finally, just one more plug for the idea of difference in perspective, that we all are looking at the things we did with very different eyes because we're in a different time and world. So to bring this back to how do we get to the future, I think there's been a concern, really since I've been several lifetimes in working around Holocaust memory and education, there's this concern of how do we pass the torch? How do we move from the witnesses of the Holocaust into the next generation? How do we pass from survivors who will not be around forever and to another generation that we would like to continue memorialization, to continue to improve on Holocaust education? And although there have been some really fascinating ways that people have been doing this, and there's incredibly important work in preserving the voices of survivors, the materials and objects and documentation of the past is a vital, vital part of that. Part of what's really required goes back to this tension I mentioned before in terms of memory and education and making mistakes. The necessary thing for us to do is to be trying things that might not work. And that's really, really hard when you have the debt of memory. So our work is really committed to this idea of creating safe spaces to really understand how these technologies can change what we do. Not to only think about them as wrapping up physical experiences and putting them online, but to really think about how these technologies and ideas and approaches change what we are capable of. And in doing that, our approach is really by working with our audiences. Now, this is not the best picture of that. This is actually us observing audiences. They're testing an augmented reality project we were doing in the museum. But it gives you a little bit of that sense of being right there with our audiences. It's a partnership, meaning in our exhibitions and in our digital spaces is created between us and these audiences. And we need to bring them into this process and really work with them in terms of understanding how they are seeing these new approaches and these new techniques and these new technologies and how they create meaning with them. Our work is really built around prototyping, which is something that seems like a luxury. And I realize that we are very fortunate to have a team that is dedicated to this specifically, but many of my colleagues who are in other sections are taking this up as well. How do you take an idea and test it with the public before you invest heavily in it, before you decide what it is good for? Augmented reality, we have a lot of theories about what it's good for, but until we actually put it into the hands of our audiences, we don't really understand that in a deep enough way that we can use it to meet our goals of memorialization and education. And so to get to the future, we not only need to be aware of what's coming and what are the possibilities, we need to be actively engaging with those before they're ready for prime time, before they're ready for massive installation, before we go large with them, to really understand the kind of impact they can have. Because Holocaust memory and education in the future will be different. I can't predict how it will be different, but if I work in partnership with my audiences, we can create a path to getting there. So I think that's plenty for right now, and I will hand it over back to Vicky. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And I think that last point there is really important and really is interesting. As a media scholar, I have very specific ideas about what virtuality, immersion, and interactivity mean. And most of the time, these words are sort of kind of meaningless because they're used in so many different ways. People who work in heritage or computer sciences have specific understandings of those terms and what technologies can do. But the audience is the most important people, right? These are the people we're trying to encourage to remember with us. Okay, I will now move on to John as our third speaker.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks again, Vicky, for inviting me to talk today. This has been fantastic so far, and I think the first thing that I'd like to remark is the fact that we've got so many people from so many places. We should talk more. Michael, I'd love to have a conversation with you about this in a more informal setting. I am going to have a chat about what I do, what Imperial War Museums does, and really look at what the last 12 months have meant for us. In terms of not only Holocaust learning and memory, but also our approach to how we engage with our audiences. So my name is John Glancy. I'm the executive producer for schools and families at Imperial War Museum. In terms of, there will be a lot of you asking what that job title means. Fundamentally, I'm the national lead for school and family audiences at IWM. Which is 5 branches. We have obviously 3 branches in London, 1 museum and 2 historic sites. A museum in Manchester where I am based, and we have a museum/historic site in Dramaturg just outside Cambridge. I'm not speaking to you today as a Holocaust specialist or even an academic. I fundamentally identify as a creative with a specialism in developing hard to reach audiences. My entire career to date has been getting people that would not normally engage in culture within cultural organizations and letting them have a meaningful experience. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the last 12 months and what that's meant for IWM and what I believe this means for the future of Holocaust memory and learning. Now, the first thing I'll remark on is I'm going to refer to it as the last 12 months, and I'm not going to put the word pandemic in there. I think whilst the pandemic has been tragic for a multitude of reasons and is a really concerning time for colleagues across all sectors, I think for me to say that everything that I'm about to talk about was because of a pandemic is doing it a disservice. There's been a huge amount of success in the last 12 months. There's been a huge amount of amazing work being done. And I think that needs to be celebrated on its own platform rather than saying, yeah, this happened because this happened. So I'm going to talk about the last 12 months. But I think we need to acknowledge that the touch paper of all this fantastic creativity and work was the COVID-19 pandemic. And what did that mean for Imperial War Museums? Well, first of all, it meant we had little to no on-site visitors. Imperial War Museums is currently closed, was closed for the majority of 2020. We opened for a short period over the summer, like a lot of our UK colleagues would have done. But it really, our museum has not been full of people, and that is sad in itself. It's also meant that we've had to pivot, which I believe is the de rigueur term that we are now using for this type of work. We've had to pivot towards digital engagement. Now, my team, in terms of schools and families, have really, really embraced this. What it's done is it's given us lots of opportunities for us to break out of that little mold of what Imperial War Museums is. That kind of idea of us being a military, a conflict museum that looks at the causes and consequences of conflict since 1914. That is absolutely our core remit, and that is what our collections are about, but it's saying that those collections live in other areas in society. So we have worked a lot in developing cross-curricular outputs for schools, ones that look at things like health and well-being, they look at things like building resilience. And we're also looking to start discussion. We understand that as an organization, we deal with problematic history every single day. We like to think we're really good at that, as well as us being able to teach students, families, adults about conflict. We'd like to say we're also going to give you some tools that you can have these difficult conversations in whatever your life is at that precise moment in time. It's also given us the ability to prioritize digital. Now, digital, for anybody who works in a role similar to mine's, is, if we're all being honest, that digital was always a kind of, we're going to create this great on-site program or this great on-gallery program, and then there's going to be a digital bit to it. And we never really prioritized it. At best, it was a dilution of what the on-site program was. At worst, it was an afterthought. It was something that we would do for a funding outcome. It was something that we would do to enhance KPIs. It was something that we would do to kind of profile and draw visitors into the museum. So we had to prioritize that and say, this is digital work for digital sake. Now, what does that mean in terms of our Holocaust learning program? The Holocaust learning program sits under my portfolio of schools. It is it's the largest area of our schools program, and it is the most well attended. We're in a very interesting place as an organization, as we are about to open new Second World War and Holocaust galleries. Now, had we been in a different world, I'd have been talking to you right now and saying, look at our new Holocaust galleries and Second World War galleries, and those have obviously been postponed in the pandemic, but we are still in a development stage. So there hasn't been a huge amount that's changed for us because that process was always going to happen. So for about the last 12 months, we've been working on, well, what does that new Holocaust learning program look like? We have new galleries with a new approach. We need a learning program that reflects that. And what we understood is that within us as an organization, we have a huge amount of skills, a huge amount of knowledge, a huge amount of scope, but we need people in to work with us. We need people to help us tell that story effectively to audiences. So in this case, we've decided that whilst the new Holocaust learning program will have a very strong on-site offer, that on-site offer will still have a digital element to it, which will then allow us to create a standalone digital program which can be accessed without coming into the museum. And in order to do that, we went out to tender and we engaged the services of a leading digital studio who have a lot of experience in app development, games design, very, very kind of vibrant, bold, creative organization. And we understood within that we needed to build a conduit between them and being these incredibly exciting visual storytellers and pedagogy and their galleries and their collections. So we decided to bring in a dramaturg, which is a very theatre term. And essentially it means it's someone who helps tell stories. And in that case, we have approached and signed an incredibly successful playwright who is an Olivier Award winner. So we really have built this fantastic team who will operate within our larger team of specialists and an external board of specialists in Holocaust learning and wider heritage. So there's lots and lots of kind of controls that we put in to make sure that the work that's being done by our creatives is consistent with pedagogy, is absolutely rooted in the national curriculum, which is what the majority of our visitors on for the Holocaust learning program will be looking to get in terms of outcomes, and also that it absolutely makes sense within our gallery and within our museum. So what good things have happened? I'm talking a lot about this in quite positive terms, I'm aware. Is I think some of the most engaging, nimble and vibrant work has been created by both my own team and wider sector colleagues. The idea of us being able to pivot towards digital engagement means it's giving us the ability to purely program. It's given us the ability to engage with varied partners that we ordinarily would not engage with, either due to geography or due to other factors that means that we kind of live within our own silo and our own locations and our own postcodes. And it's also given us the opportunity to really focus on content and storytelling rather than mechanics. When you create something on site in a museum like Imperial War Museum or a larger heritage site, so much of the work that you have to do is we need to transport 35 people through this gallery in 90 minutes and then turn it round so we can get the next group in. When you work in digital, people can access it on their own terms and on their own timeline, which means you can just focus on what they are accessing. This is really, really exciting for museums. And I genuinely believe that in terms of digital engagement, museums are unopposed in scope when it comes to digital, because we're one of, especially in culture, we're one of the few sectors that outputs are largely not public facing. We all know, and Michael, I'm sure you'll agree that only a tiny proportion of a museum's collections are actually on display. Only a tiny proportion of the expertise they have in terms of people are visible on those galleries. So being able to work in a digital way means that we become bigger than our four walls and we don't have to be contained by them. Now, there are limitations, of course there are. And I'm primarily talking from the UK's perspective. The biggest limitation that we've seen coming out over the last 12 months is that one of the new emergencies in terms of society is digital inequality. All of this digital work, all of this amazing work that's going out there isn't being accessed by some of the people in society that need to see it the most. And we can't get away from that. We can't get away from the fact that you need to have a laptop or a phone or internet access in order to engage digitally. And that is a challenge that really needs to be taken on, not just by one organization, but a sector as a whole. We need to support these people and these audiences. Also, it is this idea of, well, how do we replicate a physical interaction digitally? That is a limitation, but it's also a challenge at the same time. COVID we can talk about the fact that we live in a new normal, and, you know, with everything that's going, maybe this time next year we'll be having a very different conversation. I believe that this recovery will take some time. I think it will be very, very gradual. I think certainly, again, from the UK's perspective, that recovery will be exacerbated by other factors, potentially a new period of austerity. And also the interesting thing is, when we get to, you know, 5 years down the line, where hopefully this was just a horrible memory, we then have to look at other factors that are going to impact the ability for people to move around the country. We are in the middle of a climate emergency. The idea of travel will become increasingly an ethical conversation in the next decade. The other thing about digital is, by really investing in digital, we're actually using the same medium that's fueled the rise of things like anti-Semitism. You know, it's interesting, Tobias, you talk about the kind of importance of social media in terms of us getting our message out. There are people that are using those platforms to have the message that we are trying really, really hard to prevent. So I think it becomes a very interesting, it's very interesting we're going to start living in the same world. And as I've always said, hate works really well in a soundbite. Education doesn't always. So we have work to do in terms of that. And I guess the kind of big question now is, well, what does this mean for Holocaust memory and education? Well, I believe that the two are part of the same overall palette. Memory and testimony is vital to engage in human stories. That is what audiences like. They like that human story. That is what makes us feel things. But what we can do is we can enhance that. Now, when we're in museums, we can enhance that with wider objects and collections. In the digital world, we can still do that. We just have to do that in a different way. And Vicky asked the question when we were preparing for this is, do we think that Holocaust education and memory is at the precipice of a new era? I believe it's at the precipice of its own new era, but one that already exists for other sectors. Digital isn't particularly new, but it is new to us in many ways. And I think the key thing to move forward on this is we need to prioritize our audiences. We need to develop pedagogy and push forward our role as educators, but that isn't always to give conclusive answers, but to empower our learners to create their own and understand the history that we are telling them. It's not a universal, it's a universal story, and one that needs to resonate across societal divide. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And I thought that that quote, hate works really well in a soundbite, education doesn't, is really powerful. And one of the things I think we all educators have to think about and negotiate when working with short formats like Twitter, for example, or Instagram, the kind of image format, but particularly with complex subjects like the Holocaust. And finally, we have Eris Gorshek.
So, yeah, thank you. Thanks for all the interesting presentations so far. Thanks for inviting me to this online panel. And as Vicky already said, I'm working for a Hamburg-based independent foundation under public law. And the biggest memorial site we are responsible for is the Neuengamme concentration camp memorial. And I just tried to go to the next slide, but it seems not to work. Sorry, I have to start anew. Yeah, challenge of the new digital life. Oh, okay. So I hope it's working now. Okay, I suppose that not all of you have heard about Neuengamme. It is not as well known as, for example, Bergen-Belsen or Buchenwald. However, Neuengamme was the largest concentration camp system in northwest Germany, with the main camp and over 80 satellite camps, and more than 100,000 people from all over Europe were prisoners of Neuengamme, most of them for political or racist misanthropic reasons. At least 42,900 died. But Neuengamme seems almost invisible in the memory of an international culture of remembrance. Maybe this is due to the fact that there is hardly any visual evidence of the horror. No existing photographs or video footage of the liberation of the main camp. And when the British reached Hamburg, the main camp was emptied. So you might ask, what happened to the prisoners? What significance did the day of liberation had for them back then? And what does liberation mean to them and their families today? And these were some of the questions we answered in digital media last year as part of our memory work when the 75th anniversary of the liberation was marked. We launched the hashtag campaign 75 Liberation or 75 Befreiung shortly before International Holocaust Remembrance Day, so almost exactly 1 year ago. During 3 weeks, we shared content mainly on Twitter. This content was related to the camp's liberation and using the main hashtag and everyday additional keywords, as you can see here. And each keyword could contain a wide variety of content and stories. We wanted to make the hashtag go more viral and therefore become more visible for a greater audience by asking other memorial sites to join in. Tobias earlier mentioned this campaign already. We also created 2 Twitter bots with the help of the University of Cologne, and these bots identified the hashtags and retweeted posts. And our second intention was to establish a hashtag to support the commemorative activities of the memorial sites on the actual days of liberation between January and May 2020. And more than 3,800 messages were distributed by the 2 bots on Twitter alone. And this campaign was particularly interesting for smaller memorial sites, which received more attention for their social media accounts and also for the history of their places. Not only memorials, but also newspapers, politicians, activists and descendants of former prisoners started using the hashtag. And the hashtag was also used on Facebook and Instagram posts. So with I think it was quite a successful campaign. With the restrictions brought by the pandemic, all this digital gained a new attention and relevance. And in general, hashtag 75 Liberation became then the backdrop not only for digital communication, like I showed you, but also for digital commemoration. And our special website for the anniversary of liberation was asking, what does the 75th anniversary mean to me? At first, we asked survivors and family members to send us short videos with their answers. The answers were sent from different countries in the world and showed very individual answers. And we added short biographies and the transcriptions of the video messages and translated them into German, English, and French. As a visitor, you may browse the web page in individual order and find out more about the importance of remembering. So the creation of the website was important and engaging for the survivors' families, as well as interesting to a broader public, and nowadays can also be used in educational work. So digital formats of remembrance will not, and they don't want to be a replacement. of being physically present on site and undertaking performative gestures like you see in the picture, bringing flowers. But the interest in new formats grew last year. Compare this photo to the last I just showed you. Even though we had a small ceremony, we filmed and we put it on the website, it just didn't feel right. Not for us who were actually allowed at the memorial site, nor for the guests who couldn't come. So we missed the get-together. And on the other side, there was a great demand from people who couldn't visit the site to stay connected nevertheless, and to at least be virtually present. So it's often said how important face-to-face talks are and how special it is to talk to survivors. For the moment, we can still do that. Memorial sites started hosting contemporary witnesses talks via Zoom, like Tobias already mentioned. And this digital format had the advantage to reach a bigger audience. It has less barriers. The survivor can stay at home. The audience can participate regardless where they actually are. But how does the future look like without those first-hand witnesses? And in this context, we also certainly thinking of VR or AR project like the one of the Shoah Foundation or the Forever Project, who, as it were, preserve contemporary witnesses in virtual reality. With the help of technical development, they want to give future generations the opportunity to ask them questions, even if answers will never be real, but obviously always be recorded and therefore repeated. At the moment, such, we call it holograms, may still seem up to date and relevant, but only time will tell whether the absence of authentic, actual conversation will be also able to arouse interest, respect, or empathy. So this past year, it was made clear that we at memorial sites have to develop and add more hybrid formats to our program. Whether we are talking about commemoration or education, we have to bring the digital and the analog formats together. I think that the pandemic was a kind of catalyst which invented new formats. Memorial sites began providing different forms of storytelling and interaction, and new offers for historical understanding, and also for new or different audiences, target groups. And there was a desire to learn more and to participate, both on the part of families who were affected by Nazi crimes, and also from people who are historically or politically interested. We found digital ways to communicate and let people participate, for example, through live streams. As you can see here, we had this live streams from 3 different memorial sites on the left side, and on the right side, a grandson of a survivor could join in a live stream. So maybe at this point, I can add that we are taking up the experiences from 2020, and now we are planning our digital offer for the 76th anniversary of the liberation. And we want to offer, again, a special website, but this time in a scrollytelling format, as a form of visual multimedia storytelling. Like John said earlier, that storytelling is one of the main skills of museums. Another way, digital way to connect our e-commemoration project on Instagram, like the family history projects. I know about Silent Stories 1945, or the project you see in this slide of 2 of my colleagues. It's called Family History 1933 till today. And an important basic prerequisite of this project is that the dialogue between people with diverse family histories broadens the horizons of experience of all participants. So in this project, students were supported in researching their very own family histories. They reflected on how the history of their ancestors who lived between 33 and 45 still influences the current lives. And they also learned about the effects of persecutions on the descendants of Nazi victims and survivors, because they were talking to second and third generations via Zoom. And the students presented then their own stories, which they found out by looking at family narratives. And these stories were communicated via Instagram. And again, later on, the results and the interviews, they will be incorporated into an online educational exhibition. So we always try to think about projects which are interesting, not only for the participants, but how can we put them in future educational ideas. So for me, interaction and also co-creation, or like Michael said earlier, working with audiences are the important ideas for future forms of Holocaust education. And that means taking questions seriously and listening to our audience and being present for people who are interested in history. So yeah, memorial sites can and should raise like their authentic, serious and credible voice in the online media. Especially in these times, we see all these far-right ideologies, forms of discrimination, conspiracy myths, and et cetera, so prominent in the mainstream. So we have to be louder. Instead of being kind of passive places of remembrance, memorial sites can not only inform about historical issues, they can use social media to communicate, to listen, to connect with relatives, to find people interested in the work, to network, to inform, and to empower. So thank you.
Thank you, Eris. And if I could invite all of our speakers to turn their cameras on now. We have a wonderful 50 minutes left for conversation. There's been some great questions coming through from our audience. I thank you very much for that. What strikes me across all of your presentations is this foregrounding of storytelling, authenticity, and participation, and that all of those things are very much part of museum practice and have been for a long time, particularly authenticity when we're thinking about genocide, the Holocaust, and material evidence, and you know, the specificity of historical sites. And also education, you know, education has to be participatory, and you know, particularly since kind of experiential forms of pedagogy theory has been coming out. It's been very central to how we think about all kinds of education. So these have come to the fore when we're thinking about the digital, but they seem to have this kind of long history in both education and both memory work as well. And I guess that kind of questions this hesitance, doesn't it, about the kind of new media and that term new media. How new really is it, and how much newness does it actually make us have to think about? I'm going to start by asking each of you a question from our participants, and then if we have time, which I hope we will, I bring some of the questions up for general discussion as well. So I thought I'd start with Tobias, so because you've had the longest break away from the microphone. Someone asked, I'm just going to go back to the full question. Anne Lammers said, Tobias, thank you for your input and research. How do your research results differ if you look at diverse institutions with different means of funding or resources? For example, was the pandemic a boost for smaller initiatives or organizations because digital formats could be employed without possessing great collections or similar, or is it the reverse? Is it the large museums or other types of institutions that end up shadowing smaller, less well-funded initiatives because producing really cool digital formats is costly and time-consuming?
Yeah, thank you very much for asking these questions, Anne, and also Victoria. This is a very good question. In our survey, we didn't really kind of differentiate between the different memorials and the size of the memorials, but it became very, very obvious that actually this very sudden move to social media formats offered possibilities, especially for smaller memorial sites, and especially also for memorials that relied mostly also on volunteers and activists and things like that somehow brought in their expertise and interests. So I cannot say that this is a kind of empirical finding, but I had the feeling that maybe also because of the whole decision-making process, smaller memorial sites, and I still count also some of the bigger German concentration camp memorials to the smaller memorials and museums, were much more active and more open for experiments. As I showed, also huge and international important memorial sites like Yad Vashem were innovative and created new content, but many of them were a little bit more hesitant or were waiting more. We saw, for example, Neuengamme, and Iris talked about their work at, Iris talked about Neuengamme, but also the Mauthausen Memorial in Austria. They were very, very fast and had immediately very innovative and interesting projects. And this is the other factor. We also could see that memorial sites that were already active are using digital and social media, or already started to work with this, somehow led the way, so to say, showed the direction. While others, for example, the Buchenwald Memorial for many years was not so active online anyways. So they were also not during the first part of the pandemic. This is changing now, and my presumption is this has also to do with with people that are behind the scenes acting. So all these factors, of course, have to keep in mind. But I think it was true that social media offered a way of creating things with a very low key technology. Sometimes you just need a phone and dedicated people, and then there was a live tour, and there were participants and people watching that online also later, and Victoria writing about it in the blog. Yeah, so that was very effective.
Thank you, Tobias. And I certainly recognize some of the same things with my own research, that sometimes when you're a big institution, you have this professional image and a branding, and things have to be finished products when you release them. And for those organizations that didn't have a large amount of digital provision, there was a sudden panic. We have to do some stuff. We have to connect with our audiences. And sometimes that can make you more creative. And I think one of the things I particularly liked, and with the Instagram tour that was on the screen earlier, the Anne Frank tour of Bergen-Belsen, you could hear the wind, and you felt like you were there. When you're on tours, it's like everything's not nice and comfortable, and it's cold, it's windy, it's muddy, it's raining, and it feels really human. And I think one of the things people like, and me and Michael, you can see at least you have a nice guitar in your background. I have a mess of books, but I really like that sense of the kind of the personal, and getting beyond the professional in COVID. And people are coming to meetings in their their slacks, their hoodies, and there seems to be quite a human to human connection in these kind of more amateur things. And I think for users and these kind of social media environments, dropping the professionalism and jumping into we're just doing something, we're having a go, and the immediacy sometimes works quite powerfully. So I have a question for Michael next. This came from one of our audience as well. It was from Mihak, who's joining us from India. And the question was about the relationship between digital media and authenticity in Holocaust memory. And the quote you raised at the beginning of your talk, Michael, you use these terms, which we've heard quite often, as you said: desecration of memory, the failure of historical and aesthetic representation. That these are things that we have to really guard against with working museums and heritage. And I know, and Tobias will be very familiar with this as well, we hear these kind of concerns repeated in conversations about Holocaust representation in popular culture as well. The ideas about trivializing, distorting the past. So I wonder if you think digital media brings any specific challenges in relation to retaining the authenticity of Holocaust memory.
It's a great question, and I think it's part of that context that makes what we're doing interesting. I think part of my approach has always been that to push back on using this concern for authenticity as a way not to do things, and to try to flip that on the other side. I don't think technology in and of itself, except for the fact that it's often a format that hasn't been around for as long, right? We don't argue about whether Holocaust representation in novels is something that is appropriate to do. Now, I'm sure for the media scholars on the in this discussion, they're about whether it's done well or not is a whole different conversation. But the idea that you're going to touch on the Holocaust as part of your novel is not at all debatable. But if you're touching on the Holocaust in a game environment, that is, right? Why is that? That's because games are not taken seriously as a way of form of expression at this point in time. So I think the way that I try to look at this and looking at anything that's coming our way is not to assume that any way of expression is in and of itself by its very nature an appropriate way to handle talking about memorialization in the past. It's really to try to articulate what are the danger points, just like you would do if you were creating a classroom situation. What are the possible pitfalls in how you might approach this that would be problematic for the environment you're trying to create, and how do you manage those? So there was a game designer we had a great conversation with from, well, she's also a educational psychologist, but she also creates games from Carnegie Mellon that did a really great job of articulating 15 different possible pitfalls in a work she was creating, and then trying to address one by one how they were trying to avoid those problems. So it's not to avoid any kind of new media, it's really try to understand it and where the danger areas might be in terms of misrepresentation, in terms of unsafe experience for a participant, and figure out if there are good ways to mediate that.
Thanks,
Did that
Michael.
answer the question? I have no idea what that was.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, what strikes me as one of the biggest concerns about computer games is play, and particularly role playing. Often people say, isn't it wrong to be playing historical figures, as if that's the only way that you can make a game about the Holocaust. And in a way, you know, the Second Life exhibition of your museum created quite some time ago now, it's kind of a game space. It's game, it's not gaming, is it? An online environment. But that role-playing issue has been something that's talked about a lot in Holocaust education in classrooms, that, you know, you shouldn't role-play the Holocaust. And so if we start from that perspective when we're talking about games, then we've already put that to one side, and we think about other ways to use games. And I love this idea of starting with all the potential pitfalls, and then, and that's the challenge in designing any program. And I think that kind of moves quite nicely into thinking about design and creation processes onto John. We had quite a practical question, but I think it's quite a useful one that might be great to hear your thoughts and experience and share them with people. We've historically had this kind of, I think I mentioned it in the question with Michael there, this quite distinct divide between the kind of official institutional memory practices, the museums do it right, and the pop culture does it wrong. And we've seen that quite binary divide for quite a long time. As you raised, digital media, in different formats require particular skill sets, particularly around coding. It's much more difficult to code something if you don't know how to code than it is to kind of pick up your camera and film something. And that has mean we're seeing more partnerships across the sector. And many of you mentioned co-creation with users, but John, you particularly mentioned working with creative partners as well, so digital and drama professionals. And one of our participants asked, do you have any advice for history professionals and I guess heritage professionals looking to partner with creatives? And they said, it seems to be that that's often where projects run into trouble. And I wonder if you could talk about some of that from your own experience.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think you've kind of just touched upon it, Vicky. I think that the biggest thing in here is actually us all calling out our own unconscious biases when it comes to how we sort of see ourselves within a wider cultural spectrum. Certainly, I know as somebody who, this is my first heritage job. I did have another role at IWM before I had this role. Many colleagues who I now absolutely adore and I think now get me. I understand there was that certain element of suspicion when I came in that I was somehow going to be suggesting that we do Holocaust the musical or like all this kind of incredibly insensitive work, which was never the case. But also by the same thing, I probably had my own unconscious biases that, 3 years into the sector now, I'd be wearing leather elbow patches and I would have a room full of books and everything like that. Creativity is creativity. So for my history colleague out there, and this is something that I'm always astounded by, The amount of colleagues that I've met within the museum and actually having to say to them, you're a creative, you are. And I want to kind of grab people by the shoulder sometimes and go, do you realize how amazing you are? And I think we need to acknowledge that. I think that if I think about my museum professional head and my theatre maker head, they're very, very similar. The big changes that I have as a theatre maker, I have the luxury of license. Not everything has to make sense. And going at your point, Michael, I could do a romantic drama that referenced the Holocaust, and that exists out there in the world. But as a museum professional, I have the luxury of authenticity. And that is essentially what my kind of keystroke is in there. I'm backed by pedagogy, I'm backed by a national collection and all these kind of things. So when you go out to working with creatives, it really comes in at the recruitment process. You need to engage with creative partners that understand that is what you have to offer. Now, I can talk as a creative in saying that is incredibly exciting, because to go into that idea of pop culture being wrong, if you're working with theatre makers, if you're working with games designers, they are used to that fact that they are somehow not high art. And they're used to that, and they kind of sometimes will carry that as a bit of a chip on their shoulder. If they're approached by an organization that goes, we understand that you have a really specific skill set that we're interested in working with you, and what we're going to give to you is we're going to give you this knowledge, we're going to give you this authenticity, we're going to give you this pedagogy, we're going to support you throughout that entire process, then that relationship does become a lot easier because you're meeting on equal terms. The worst thing you can do when you're working with a creative is to get into a kind of client service provider relationship. It doesn't work, because fundamentally it means that both of you are pushing an agenda which will clash against each other. You invite people on as collaborators and you invite people on as partners. If that creative organization that you're working for are not taking a note, they're not listening to you, they're saying, well, we want to do our own way, then actually that problem was at the recruitment process. You have the wrong creative. If you get the right creative, they will understand what a heritage organization, a museum, an academic team bring to the table, and they should, if they're good at their job, embrace that.
Thanks, John. And I've had the luxury to see some of the processes that you've been involved with at the Imperial Museum with the project that you're working on at the moment. And it's fantastic. And it's really refreshing for me as an outsider to see, we don't get to see behind the doors at museums, and to see these kind of collaborative processes. And I think that's really important term that, many of you coming back to this idea of partnership and co-creation. It's not just about work, communicating just at users. And to me, this seems to be something about this kind of, decentralizing the kind of expert here, or recognizing where one's expertise end and someone else's might begin. So that, a museum professional is not necessarily a digital expert, but a historical expert. You said about kind of authenticity, John. And I've always wondered whether this might be the better way to approach some of these kind of sensationalist things that end up in the headlines. So young people taking selfies, or the Holocaust challenge on TikTok, that if we actually reached out to some of these young people and said, hey, what do you know about TikTok? What do you know about selfies? How are they useful? What do you know about using this format? How viral do you go? Why do you do it? And how could we use that format? And hey, here's some information about the Holocaust and genocide and ethics, and have a conversation. It might be more productive going forward in terms of getting kind of younger people being really productive and active in Holocaust memory. I'm going to move on to Eris with a question, and we'll come back and have some of these bigger debates in a minute. So Eris, one of the things I found so powerful about your brilliant work using social media with this campaign is that, for me, I saw this transition of sites that were once networked as places of violence during the Nazi regime have now become a network of memory through your work on social media, through the hashtag and through the Twitter accounts. But I wondered how much participation in using that hashtag was with new audiences. So you mentioned the institutions, the different memorial sites, academics, politicians, survivors and their families. Did you see any evidence of kind of getting new audiences involved in Holocaust memory and memory of these particular concentration camps?
So thanks for the question. Well, I was hoping when we have stories that are on a low level that everyone can join in, and because Twitter is very short messages, so it's not like very complex, and this is also some kind of challenge to have snackable content with a hard story behind. So we were hoping to just encourage or encourage people to join in and talk about what they have in their families and so on and so on. And yes, indeed, there were people they didn't knew about us. They were seeing our posts and were coming to us. For example, even second or third generation, they had, look, I still have letters of my mom. She was writing from a camp, or of my dad. And so it had a real impact to our real life work, what we did on this campaign. But at first, I have to admit, and you said it already, it was more like connecting memorials. So when you think about it, in April 2019, there were 5 accounts of memorial sites communicating on Instagram, and in April 2020 we were 38. So it was really rising, and so I think in 2020 memorial sites really have learned not only to see social media as a byproduct, but to see it's really something people are related to, are interested. We can gain new interest and new audiences. So I think it was very important to have this covered, because in the early times, people could come to me and say, oh, what you are doing, it's just for you, it has no impact. And it's obvious that the media, the digital media has a lot of impact. And I think it was a learning process. So yeah, I don't know if this answered your question, but.
That was perfect, thank you. And I think kind of John as well touched on this kind of tension between the kind of brevity of kind of social media or some digital spaces, and the kind of the nuance and complexity of any education, but particularly when we're looking at very complex events or a multiple series of events like the Holocaust. Tobias showed one of the examples from Neuengamme with the investigating objects, and actually that's a way in Holocaust education, objects are incredibly central, where you just put a shoe or an object, you think, what stories can we tell about this? What can we learn about this object? And that's one really good way, I suppose, in social media to do the snackable content. I love your phrase that you use. I think it's a brilliant phrase, and that inspires something else. That everything in the digital doesn't have to happen just in that digital space. It could be a prompt for education offline, and we are offline as well as being online simultaneously, right? Okay, I'm going to throw out some big questions now from our participants. Feel free, if you prefer to just if you want to raise your hand to speak, or if you just want to turn your microphone on, that's fine. So one of the questions that was asked was, do you think younger generations are interested in commemorating the Holocaust, or do you think that people that are keeping commemoration alive are still the older generations? And I suppose, does that affect how we use digital media for this? John, give it.
Another great question. I think that young people are intrinsically sensitive to the world that they live in. And I think that I'm incredibly heartened by the generation that will have to look after me and my dotage. And I think that the massive movements that are happening in terms of them looking for an equal and fairer society, where I think the challenge is avenues and pathways for them to be able to engage in Holocaust memorial. And that can come down to the idea of, for all the things that we talked about, digital inequality, location of sites, all these kind of things, they're the actual challenge. So I think that the young people, they want to engage with us. And I believe not just the Holocaust, I think all important social matters about making sense of this crazy civilization that we live in. But we need to create the pathways, and we need to open the door for them sometimes.
I would also like to add to that. So I totally agree with what John said. And I think it is important that we see that even if there is kind of failed commemorative practice, like for example last summer with the TikTok controversy, Holocaust controversy, these all are examples for the interest of younger generations to somehow make Holocaust memory part of their lives. And social media is an important part of this generation's life. And so we see here also ways of, so to say, integrating this aspect and this history into these social media lives. And as John said, I think this is one of the most important reasons why there should be, so to say, best practice examples by established institutions, why there should be kind of participatory offers to follow these pathways and continue to develop decent and honest and reflexive forms of Holocaust commemoration online. And I think the users can definitely participate in this. But the flip side of this is what I found also interesting with the pandemic is that also older generations, which might have had a much more personal attachment to the memorial sites because they were active there for many years, and then they also started then suddenly to get used to certain technologies which were not part of their lives before in order to keep this contact. And this I also found interesting, that we had actually a kind of bridging the generational gap through the situation of Holocaust memorials and museums going online, integrating their classical audience with a new audience, so to say. At least that was my observation, although I have no figures for that. And I hope that we will follow this path. But of course, this, as Victoria said, and because Anne Lammers asked this also, this does not mean that all memorials have to go online or fully digital, but that there will be a kind of combination between both and different pathways and access forms, so to say, to this memory and also to these institutions.
Thank you, Eris.
Yeah, from my perspective, as one who's working at a memorial site, I think the younger generation is very interested. I can see it when we are doing art projects, commemorative art projects. They come up with great ideas, and also the TikTok challenge, for example. And what I see in all this is they focus a lot on overwhelming emotions. So for them, the emotion is something very important when they talk about Nazi times, about the Shoah, etc., etc. So this is the point where we can come to a conversation. So when I'm thinking, for example, another project where young students were talking to grandchildren of perpetrators. So this was so interesting because they had so many questions also related to things happening today. So it was not like far away. So all this communication, all this emotion coming when you are talking face to face to people, all these discussions, they are really interested. It's not like far away. So all this digital give them another another chance to join in, to raise their own voice, to get into communication. And it's also a challenge for us as a memorial site, because our educational goal is not to overwhelm people with emotion. So we have to discuss what the right way for you, for us, how can we talk about the history of the place. So I think it's great to have this digital, because it's on the same level communication when you are in the social media, for example. And that's very interesting, because someone 14 years old would never write us a letter or something. So, but they can only write us a message, and yeah, there the communication is happening.
I think that the significance of emotion there for young people is really interesting, because I mean, particularly in the UK, but I know even more globally, there's been a shift away from atrocity images. So in the immediate post-war period, it's like people need to see the horror of what happened, and now most classrooms where people are being taught about the Holocaust, it's we don't need to show those horrific images. And yet, as soon as someone puts Bergen-Belsen or the Holocaust into Google after their lesson to find out more, it's often those images that they come across. And so yeah, there seems to be kind of detachment between what young people take as really significant and what we what we do as educators in many ways to protect them, because we don't, as you said, Iris, we don't want to traumatize our students or upset our students in our classrooms. Michael, did you want to add anything to that?
I don't know that I have to. I mean, I agree, that there's an incredibly vibrant conversation that is happening and is waiting to happen in other ways with all of these audiences. And I think we talk about youth audience as if they're somehow different, right? Like that they're yet again another audience that we need to be in conversation with and understand where they are coming from in this discussion. Just to give a little bit of a citation, the founding director of one of our most important youth programs, Lynn Williams, used to talk about the fact that as they were developing programs for, at the time, primarily African-American Washington, D.C., that the history is deep and powerful. And all you really need to do is give them an authentic encounter with that history. So the interest is there. It's a question of how do you maintain that conversation.
Brilliant. And I think Tobias was touching on the kind of transgenerational communication with the digital, and I think many of my fellow teachers would be aware of how many of our young students actually are quite resistant or not so keen in being in spaces like Zoom with cameras on and microphones, and for often very good reasons. And I think it was the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Centre last year. They were talking about one of their oldest Holocaust survivors was like, "Get me on Facebook, get me on YouTube. When am I next online? This is great." So we make these assumptions that the digital is for young people, I think, and it can be for anyone. I think the majority of Holocaust events or kind of activities I've been seen online or kind of participated in have been people of kind of my age and older. We are all digital, relatively digital savvy as well. We like these spaces. I'm going to move on to a more political question, actually, and I think this is really important. And the question refers to I'll give the context and then lead with the question. So the participant is referring to the libel trial taking place currently in Poland between two Holocaust researchers, so Professor Barbara Engelking and Professor Zbigniew Grabowski, and on account of their publication Night Without End related to the period of the Holocaust in Poland. The civil trial is supported by the institution close to the Polish national government and subsided with public funds. And the organisation is arguing that two scholars are guilty of harming the dignity and pride of Poles. And this is part of what's kind of been kind of more colloquially kind of referred to as kind of Poland's kind of Holocaust law. It's got obviously a more official name, and disputes about what truths about history or what versions of history are allowed to be spoken about in particular political spheres. And the question says, kind of, what's your opinion on kind of the future of Holocaust memory within this context of the rise of populisms and nationalism in Europe and elsewhere in the world as well? And can digital media be an asset to independent Holocaust research? So I think in this context, it's when scholars are kind of banned or that writing and publishing a book could be illegal, or you could be banned from speaking in a university or arriving into a country. Could the digital help independent Holocaust research under these kind of tightening regimes?
So maybe I start. Yeah, so first of all, of course, it's very important that you ask this question, and it's also very important that we all contribute to raising more attention for this really shocking attempt to criminalize Holocaust researchers. And I'm really happy that many colleagues around the world support both of them. Part of the whole idea, of course, is that this open discussion about the potential of digital Holocaust memory is also, of course, about freedom of expression and scientific freedoms, which have to be guaranteed on the one hand. And this is also why I think that we should use these tools, of course, for informing about the Holocaust, for fostering Holocaust commemoration, for showing best practice models, but not for kind of censoring things or denouncing kind of failed Holocaust commemoration. That again, that was what I found really a pity in this TikTok issue, that there was kind of shaming of young people who did not they were not Holocaust deniers, yeah, but they were treated like Holocaust deniers. And then it becomes problematic, because that's the other thing. The flip side of the thing is that social media is, of course, already a forum for Holocaust denial, for relativization, for a way of kind of rewriting history. And if there is no different presence, then this will be the voice on social media regarding the Holocaust. And I think we need more kind of studies and research about it, and more kind of initiatives. I know that the Holocaust memorials and the big Holocaust memorials, especially the USHMM, are already very active in this field. Yeah, and this also means that we have to kind of think about how to create alternative channels for Holocaust research, use digital media in order to spread this research, to make it public, especially when it is banned. But yeah, for Europeans, of course, this really means also politically how to deal in the future with governments like in Poland or in Hungary, because you cannot say on the one hand, the Holocaust is the negative founding myth of Europe, and we foster Holocaust education and Holocaust commemoration because it's part of European identity. And then there is a bluntly rewriting or kind of different balancing, so to say, of historical facts in member countries of the European Union that needs to be addressed on a political level too.
And I'll just throw in one small comment. I mean, I totally appreciate what Tobias just said. And but just to add to that, I think going back to my theme before of lack of inevitability, right? The idea that technology can be a tool to be used to combat some of this stuff going on is not inevitable. And the ways that networks and the platforms that we use are set up and the way that they are run is not inevitable, right? So the idea that technology can be a tool that we use isn't a given, and it's something that I'd like to see more of our institutions really taking part in, is thinking about how these tools are created and maintained in such a way that they can continue to be used in the fight against the kind of suppression and other problems that are out there.
And I think in some ways we think about the digital as being kind of detached from the national, that we can speak more freely online, perhaps because we're not in a space where we could be arrested, we could have a passport taken away from us. But I mean, one of the issues we're facing with new laws in Hong Kong and teaching students from Hong Kong is that recorded content that they might be involved in could be used against them, or against us, in fact, as well. And I think this is something we need to think very carefully about recording Zoom sessions, or indeed just putting things on social media. In fact, in teaching young people who might be being brilliant advocates and activists and defending memory, the effects it could have on them in some of these nations. This issue rings true in Britain. We're not where Poland and Hungary are politically at the moment, but there's certainly been discussion in Parliament that we should only talk about the British Empire in a good light in educational context in schools in the UK. And for me, this has an impact on Holocaust education, because we can't talk about places like Bergen-Belsen in Mauritius, where the British detained Jewish refugees until 1945. And the places where the colonial history and the Holocaust intertwine, basically shouldn't be spoken about in schools anymore. And the British narrative is under quite a lot of light at the moment with the development of a new Holocaust education memorial space. And I'm certainly going to be very interested about how much of that kind of content, if we're not supposed to be talking about in schools, can also be discussed in those kind of spaces as well. Okay. John, did you want to come in?
Oh, yes, it was just to say, I agree with you, Vicky. I think that is certainly something that we're seeing in the UK at the moment. And I guess my probably idealistic view is there that history is not political, history is the truth. And it is such a complicated, I'm almost sitting here, and I'm not someone who generally self-censors, but I'm aware that this is being recorded and could be used as FOI. Just to sort of say that there is that question in there is, as historians, how do we have conversations? How do we make mistakes in front of each other? And I think that's really, really important. How do we make mistakes and not have them come and bite us in the bum in 5 years' time when something is taken out of context? And it's a scary time to live.
I've become very aware of this trying to set up the Digital Holocaust Memory blog, and part of the idea of that project was that if I'm going to be writing and criticising all the work you lovely people are doing, then I should be doing my own research through digital mediums. And and blogs are a kind of are a draft form. They're ideas, they're thoughts, and I do worry sometimes that someone might quote one of my blogs, and then like 3 years down the line, I've written an academic article that's been peer reviewed and published, and it says the opposite of what the blog, and whether the blog will have probably a higher readership than the peer-reviewed article, and the effect that might have on how my work is understood. But yeah, these are incredibly pressing issues, and I don't think anyone has the answer about where we go with this. And I think it is about, as you said, about being careful and also training people. And I know the USC Shoah Foundation have been doing quite a lot of work around digital Holocaust memory and digital literacy, that the two come together, that you can't think about the Holocaust in digital spaces and work with the Holocaust in digital spaces if you're not also thinking about digital literacy at the same time. I'm going to come on to a different subject. It's talking about identity. I think this is a really interesting question. So finding the beginning of the question. Suzanne Luhmann said, regarding the diversification of Holocaust memory under the conditions of a pandemic, and a move or expansion to the digital and virtual worlds, what are the gender effects of the move to digital Holocaust memory, both in terms of who creates new techniques, how that affects what topics and approaches rise to the top and which do not, and user demographics? And I just want to say, Suzanne, that yesterday, myself, Stephanie Billab, and Tobias Weidman did a panel in hosted by Felsted and Polin, and we were celebrating afterwards. It was an all-female digital tech Holocaust panel. So yeah, I'd be really interested to hear other people's perspectives on this. Eris, would you like to start? Or?
Because I'm female. So yeah, question is also a little bit like, which topics should we talk about in the digital world to set a visible sign in the name of democracy or diversity today? And I think, yes, even memorial sites like Neuengamme, we already launched a project like Black History Matters, or like Pride Untold. I've shown you in my presentation. It just, the most interesting, for example, tweets we had in our campaign 75 Liberation were the stories untold. So when we were talking about queer biographies, for example, it was like, what? Or when we were talking about Black prisoners, for example, something like that. So all these, what seemed to be new, seems to be interesting. And yes, I think memorial sites also can be kind of political, because we have the knowledge about atrocities, and we can talk about what happens in the worst place. So yes, we should have to think about which topics do we want to talk about, and where do we want to set a sign or a stop sign to conspiracy myths or something like that.
I would also like to add to this. Again, I don't have the kind of empirical evidence on that, because we did not kind of try, at least not yet, try to kind of do a gender differentiated analysis. But from really following as much as I could since last March, the content produced during COVID-19 and the activities of several memorials, I've really found that there was definitely how to say this? It really had a kind of female face for me. So what Victoria said about this event with Stephanie and Tobias is I think symptomatic for it. Or if I think about this kind of joint Zoom tour with Neuengamme, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau, it was 2 women guiding and one guy. Eris was one of the women. So and of course it has again to do with people. Yeah. So it was the kind of public relations or education departments that were active, and sometimes maybe in education section there are more women. But nevertheless, I had the feeling that social media activities was not in that case kind of gender biased, that we only had kind of tech guys or something like this being present there. And that was what I found particularly interesting and nice about this kind of alliance of Holocaust commemoration and the use of social media technology. And also when I think about projects like Eva Stories or the Anne Frank YouTube video diary, or also many of the videos in this TikTok Holocaust Challenge, obviously there is, so to say, there are female voices and female stories to be told. And Iris already talked about the queer dimension of the whole thing, and also with other groups. So that was, for example, something which was particularly interesting about the activities of the Dachau Memorial, that their live tours was offered a possibility to talk about issues that would not usually be in the focus of tours on the memorial, that they could talk to smaller, more kind of particular groups that had specific interests. For example, if I remember right, Steffen Joost from Dachau told me that the tour dealing with persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses was one of the most popular tours they offered. Yeah, so I think that is a great potential, that we can tell also the stories on the margins and not always need to tell the main story of the Holocaust.
Sorry, yes, I agree with everything that everyone said, and at the risk of being the straight white man that's talking about gender equality, I think that it goes back to my kind of previous point in there about it's about pathways, and it's us kind of understanding is creating opportunity and opening the door as much as we can to ensure that we have diverse voices. So personally, from our project team, so the people who are working on the new Holocaust Learning team program, from an IWM perspective, I'm actually the only man that sits on that project team, which is really, really positive. And our external advisory board, we actively look to ensure that board, of which Vicky and lots of other fantastic humans sit on, we actively look to make sure that was as reflective of society as is possible. There's so much work to do, and again, it's no one organization is going to solve that. That is sectoral change, that we all need to work together and ensure that in some ways, perhaps the changes now will be piecemeal, but how do we ensure that in 20, 30 years, we're not having the same conversation?
And I'll just throw in a quick balancing piece, right? There's incredible opportunity, and it's really exciting to see people taking advantage of the idea of being able to diversify around the conditions we're in currently. And I think the question you just raised, John, about making sure that continues forward, but also to balance that out. And again, I don't know Europe as well as the United States, but under the pandemic, and in the museum field in general, which is, I think, skews definitely as a female, larger number of women in the field than men. The number of women who were hit really hard in terms of the pandemic and the expectations of childcare should not be missed, right? Like, so, looking at the number of women that I know that have left positions in the last year because of expectations around that and other problems is a real downside that's happening at the same time, whether that is the case all over the world, but I've just seen a lot of it in the United States.
Thanks, Michael. And it's really important there. I think one of the things we need to be really conscious of as well when we're working with digital technology, that so often people talk about the kind of digital as somewhat kind of objective or machinic, like it's kind of separate from us and our culture and humans. And I think we always need to remember that algorithms are programmed by human beings for human reasons. We decide what we want an algorithm to do, and then we program it to do that. And that a lot of the kind of machine learning, the early kind of work in machine learning sets was deeply problematic in terms of homophobia, racism, and misogyny, and a range of other deep-seated problems. So every time we use technology, I think we need to think about that it's part of our society and we work with it, and it works with us as well, and that somewhere between that something emerges out of it. And the VR or social media are not in themselves racist or homophobic or dangerous or bad to use for memory, but it's always about how we use these tools. I'm aware that we've only got a few minutes left. So I'm not going to pose another question because I think it would be speeding people through responses unfairly. But I just want to say a huge thank you to all of our guests. It's been a really interesting conversation. It's nice to hear from diverse experiences, not only in terms of individuals, but from different countries and different kinds of perspectives on this. We've had the academic, we've had the Imperial War Museum, which is, as John said, a kind of conflict museum primarily, and has Holocaust aspects to its work. The United States Holocaust Museum, which is a museum, but not at a site of atrocity, and at a country that was kind of geographically away from the kind of crux of the mass murder of the Holocaust. And then obviously Eris from Neuengamme, which was one of the concentration camps in Germany. I just want to say to finish that I'm really, really lucky to be continuing to chair a range of future events this year between now and May. These are all related specifically to digital Holocaust memory, and they include sessions around computer games, Holocaust now and distortion online, virtual Holocaust memorialization, and social media. So some of the topics we've kind of touched on in bits here will be much more focused on in these longer sessions. And if anyone's interested in that, you can register on the website digitalholocaustmemory.com and just click on the news section, and the links are there. And it would be lovely to see people there and talk about some of these issues in far much more detail. And again, I'm really, really thankful to our wonderful guests for taking time out, particularly during these really difficult times, to participate in this conversation. So thank you all very much.